All right. Welcome everybody to another episode of WebDev. All right. Yeah. So we had discussed in our last lecture the use of state, right, to manage the data that is changing over time, right, as user interacts with the user interface, right? They manipulate data structures, and we need to be able to represent those changes in the user interface, right? If they add or remove or delete something, the user interface needs to be able to respond to that. And we had discussed two types of state, right, depending on the scope and whether it was something that was a maybe a small form, a set of input fields that was constrained to a single page or maybe a subset of components, and we refer to that as local state. But if was something more sophisticated that spanned several pages, right, perhaps across multiple parts of the application, then we refer to that as global state. Right? That using use state was complicated things, right? That introduced coupling between the components, and it was going against also the separation of concerns, right? That one component was doing too much maintaining state, right? And also rendering, right? Handling all the events. So we discussed that there are alternative libraries that we can use that either React's own context API or third-party libraries such as ZooStand or Redux, and we had introduced Redux, right, as the library that we're covering. So we're going to continue that discussion, and we're going to take a look at how is it that we can use those skills that we introduced in our last lecture, right, and we're going to start applying that, right, to our Kambaz application, right. So we're going to just like we discussed in our prior lecture, we're going to first demonstrate how to use use state, right, to maintain state, as users add courses, remove courses, add modules, and then demonstrate that there's an alternative, right, that we can use instead Redux to do the same thing. And in some cases, we want to use only one, or only the other, or maybe even a combination between the two. So we'll point those out when is it that it's appropriate to do use local state or global state or a combination of the two. Also, this week the midterm is going to be available, and you can take it anytime. It's going to be available for a whole week, and it's open book, just like all the quizzes so far. Right? It's basically one long quiz, and it's about 100. I think it's like 100 minutes long, and it covers all the material that we saw from the beginning of the semester up until the lecture, the last lecture, right, that we covered local state. So definitely global state is not in the midterm. Right? So no Redux, no anything like that, no reducers, store providers, things like that. Right? But definitely the using use state, right, to maintain the changes of a variable over time, right? If a user clicks on something, right, manipulates it, how does the user interface react? So that's definitely going to be in the midterm. Again, you have a week. The exam will be available, I believe, maybe today and for the next week or so. So please find a block of time that you can focus on and complete that on your own. Again, it's open book, so you can use the slides or also any code that I've shared with you or your own GitHub. But please abstain from using tools such as ChatGPT or Claude or any of these, or even the internet. Just please don't use search engines or anything like that. So, but yes, you can use all the material that we've provided for you. Okay, let's talk about stateful dashboard, right? And what we mean by that is that the current implementation is using some static data. Right? So there's a whole bunch of JSON files, and that contain several arrays of courses, modules, assignments, and we have collected all these files into a single file that we call the database, right? This is like quote unquote database. It's not really a database, right? It's just one big object, right, that contains properties called courses, modules, assignments, right, that are basically holding several arrays of these objects that represent, courses and modules and so on. Right? And and right now it's a dynamic in the sense that it renders the courses from this data structure, so they're not hard coded inside of the dashboard component or the dashboard page, right? It uses an algorithm to dynamically iterate over the array of courses to render each one of the courses dynamically. So we could change the courses by modifying the JSON file, right? Same thing for modules, right? When you navigate to a particular course from the dashboard, we encode the ID of the course, right? And then we load the specific modules for that specific course. So in that sense, it's dynamic, right? It's driven by the data. We call it data driven. But other than that, it's not very dynamic in the sense that it can't change over time, right? We cannot manipulate these data structures. We can't change a module. We can't add new modules. We can't delete an assignment. We can't create new courses. So in that sense, it's static. So we're going to be applying the skills that we've been practicing in the labs, right? Using such things such as use state, right? And also reducers, right? To convert these pages so that they are dynamic, right? That we can implement all the CRUD operations. We should be able to create, read, update, and delete any of these data structures, create new courses, create new modules, delete assignments, update, and so on. Okay. So this is currently the implementation, and it's rendered dynamically from an array of courses. And again, we cannot change this data structure, right? What we'd like to be able to do is have buttons that would allow us to perhaps create a new course, maybe like a create button here, maybe an input field that we can type in the title of the course, right, the description of the course, maybe even have like a delete button that we can remove a course, right, or maybe an edit button that would allow you to change the title and the description of the course. Now, all these changes that we're going to be talking about today here are about modifying data that is currently in the browser. The browser downloads these JSON files, right, creates the course array, puts it in this quote unquote database, and we can manipulate a copy of that data structure as we iterate over that data structure and render it in the browser. Now, any changes that we're going to be making, we're not manipulating the original JSON file. We can't do that, right, from the client, from a browser. I mean, we could do it if this were running on a server, right, which Next.js is, right? But because we are manipulating things, because we're clicking and dragging, all this code is running on a browser. So the browser doesn't have any capabilities of manipulating the original file, the original JSON file. So all these changes are going to be in memory in the browser. So when we refresh the screen, right, all those changes are going to go away, right? It's going to reset to the original state, right, of the original JSON file. Okay, so later on when we introduce Node.js in the next lecture, right, then we will be talking about capabilities of delegating to the server a task of, for instance, either manipulating a file, right, like a JSON file, right, or inserting and updating a database, and so we can make these changes permanent, right? But right now we don't have that capability, right, of that server. That's they'll have to wait till the next lecture. Okay, so let's implement several CRUD operations. Meaning we're going to be able to create, right, update, delete, read, the various CRUD operations. So first we'll do with the create, or adding new courses. So the current implementation in the dashboard page, right, is using the database, right, to initialize a local constant called courses. And right now that is like the name suggests, it's a constant, right? It can't change over time. And we saw that although we could maybe declare this as a let right? And this would be a variable that can change over time. We saw that any manipulation to a data structure would be futile. And we could see that we can indeed manipulate the data structure, but those changes would not be reflected in the user interface, right? We could even see the changes happening if we print them to the console, right? Like the example we saw in the count and the counter, right? We were able to change the count, but those changes were not reflected into the user interface. And we discussed why that was, that that Redux was lazy, right? In the sense that it optimized any modifications or updates to the DOM. That only if we explicitly declared a variable to be a state variable, right? Otherwise, it doesn't reflect the changes to regular variables. It doesn't reflect them to the user interface. But if we convert it into a state variable like this using the useState hook, then we would be able to manipulate, make changes to those variables through a mutator, right, or setter function provided by the useState hook. And those changes then would definitely be reflective in the user interface, right? So to convert the normal regular courses variable into a state variable, we're going to use the useState hook. We're going to provide an initial value, the same initial value that we had earlier, right? The DB courses. So now courses here has as initial value all the list of all the courses. Plus we get a mutator or setter function, right? That is going to allow us to manipulate this data structure. We're going to be able to, we're going to be able to do add new courses, remove courses, update courses, all the CRUD operations within this page. Also here we have a template for a course object that we're going to be using. We're going to be appending to the array, right, of courses. We're going to be setting new course. We're going to be appending a new course at the end of the array. We're going to use this as a template, right? So that has some default values as a dummy primary key, some dummy name and number, some bogus start dates and whatnot. Okay. So the add new course function here is going to be an event handler that when we click on an add button, we're going to invoke this function. And what it's going to do is that it's going to create a new instance for a course, right? It's going to copy over from the template of course, right, that contains the default name, default number, default ID. And then we're going to override the ID. We're going to keep all the default values, the default name, number, start date, and whatnot. But we are going to override the primary key so to make sure that it is unique. Right, this is a new library, the UUID library. You might need to install that library. You'll have to do something like npm install UUID. And then we can use it to create a new instance of a unique identifier. And notice the name of the primary key that I'm choosing, right, has this underscore in front of it. That's so it's forward compatible with the objects that we're going to be working with in the next couple of assignments, right, that are going to be using MongoDB objects, right? Objects are stored in and created in the Mongo database. And Mongo uses the underscore ID as the name of the primary key. And that's why, right, I want to make sure that any code that we write today, it's forward compatible, right, with those upcoming assignments. Right, so once we create a new instance of a course, we can append it at the end of the array. Right, this is a brand new array that we're creating. We're copying over all the courses at the beginning of the array, and then appending at the end this new course that we've created. And this new array, we're using the setter, right, to modify the array. We're saying, hey, whatever old array you had, well, replace it with this new one that's just basically your original courses plus this new one that I'm adding at the end. Once we add that, we can create a new add button, right? Maybe below our dashboard heading, right? Maybe we can say, have a new heading, a smaller heading, saying new course, right? And then add a button that it floats to the end, so it'll be all the way to the right-hand side, right? And we click on it, right? We call the add new course. Notice here the syntax that we're not passing any arguments, right? Notice the function doesn't take any arguments, right? So it's easier, right? We can just provide the name of the function, right, as the value for our onClick. Now, even though we're not passing any arguments, the onClick will pass a default parameter, right? So here, right, this argument here, we are actually receiving something. We are receiving the event object, right? We had discussed in our prior lecture that there's an event object that here we are ignoring, but it has, all the metadata, including a reference to the target. In this case, it would be a reference to this button, right? And or if it's an input field or checkbox, it will have references to those initial input fields, right, that we would have access to. But here we are ignoring it, right? It's being passed to us, but we don't care about it. All right, so let's take a look at implementing now the delete, right? Again, we're implementing all the various CRUD operations that are common to any data structure. Delete is one of them, CRUD. It's the D in CRUD. So to do that, right, it's a common implementation that to calculate or remove an element from an array, we can just filter out that particular item, right? Courses.filter allows you to skip over some elements in the original array, right? So this original array of courses, with filter, we're gonna compute a smaller array that is gonna skip over some items. Which one? Well, the one that the particular course, as we're iterating over them, we're going to check to see if a particular course has the ID that it's equal to the course ID that we want to remove. So we're going to pass here as an argument the ID of the course we're removing. If we find it, we want to skip over it, meaning I want all the courses whose ID is not the ID of the course that I want to remove. So the resulting array is going to be all the courses minus, right, this one course that we are removing. That once we have the new array, right, we use set courses to replace the old array of courses with this brand new array of courses, which is missing that deleted course. We can call it from the line item, right, that implements the particular course, right? We're adding a new delete button, right, that when we click here, we can call the delete course and pass the ID of the course that we want to remove. That's what we're expecting, right? We're expecting the ID of the course that we are removing. And also notice here that this time around, we are not ignoring the event object that gets passed to the event handler, right? So here's our event handler, right? That is implemented using this arrow function, right? And we're using the event object to prevent the default. We're saying event.default, prevent default. The reason we need that is that if you remember, all these cards, right, are embedded inside of a link, right, that's not shown here. So these are all hyperlinks, right, that if you click anywhere in the card, right, it's going to cause a navigation, right? It's going to navigate to that course, right? We encode the ID of the course and so on, right? So even if you click on any button, if you click on this delete button, also, right, the event of clicking that will cause the link to navigate, right? So what we're doing here is that we are preventing that from happening. What the way React handles the events is that it starts with the narrowest context of where the event occurred, which in this case is this delete button, and so the event once it hits or is generated by a particular target, what it does is that it bubbles up, right, the DOM tree, starting at the leaves of the tree, and then it bubbles up all the branches until, looking to see if there's any other element that cares about this particular event. In this case, there is. We do have a hyperlink here, right, that is wrapping the entire card, which is not listed here. There's a link here. And it's going to, if it hits that particular link, it will cause the default behavior to navigate to this course. So it would be fairly weird that we are going to delete a course, and then we're going to navigate to a course that has been removed. So that would make no sense. Right? So yes, the course would be removed, and then once it's removed, it then would navigate to the course that doesn't exist. So that's why we are preventing the default. Another thing to consider here is that as we're iterating over the courses and we have a reference to the course, the particular course, all these buttons are being generated, right? One per course. And so when we click on this particular delete button, there's going to be a dozen, half a dozen courses that have been created. So each button needs to be able to remember which course was it that was used to create this button, right? So that it can know, right, that the ID of that particular course. And so how does that happen? And well, what's happening here is that notice that we are wrapping our code inside of this outer arrow function here. And so this is what is referred to in JavaScript as a closure, right? And closures have the particular aspect, right, or feature that it remembers the state that was in place, right, when the closure was defined. So for instance, it remembers, for instance, what was the course object, when the closure was created, and so that particular course had a specific ID. And this is useful for this particular instance, right? That we are handling the event, this click event, and we need to be able to remember, right? It reinstantiates, it recreates the state that was there when the closure was defined. So it remembers what course it was, so it knows what the ID is, so it can pass it to the delete, right? So that it can remove that course. Very, very useful feature. Now let's go about editing a course. Right? This would be U, or updating a course. And so what we're going to do is that we were using this course constant as a template for the courses that we were adding to the array of courses, right? So, for adding a new course, we were using this course as an initial template, and then we would override the ID. But if we make the course now a state variable, that means that we're going to be able to manipulate this course, right? Using the setter, we can change the values such as the name, the number, the end date, the start date, and whatnot. Okay, and so we're going to use that so that if we edit a course, instead of adding the same course over and over, we're going to be able to edit the name of the course, right, or the description of the course. So now that the course is a state variable, right, now we can define input fields or text areas that allows us to edit the course's name and the course's description. Plus, perhaps we can add other fields such as start date and end date, a couple of, some date pickers, right? So these input field and text area are initialized with the values of the course name and course description. If we want to be able to type and change these values, we'll need to add some unchange event handlers, right, that use the set course, right, to manipulate or update the name or description of the course. Notice that we're using the familiar strategy, right, of computing a new course based on the old course, right? So this is the new course. It's going to be this object, which is going to be, most of the fields are going to be the same fields as the existing course, right? That from the field, right? But we are going to override the name, right? We're overriding the name and setting it to the value of the input field target, right, that you're editing. Or in the description, we're using the current value of the text area, right, to be able to edit the description. Since we are editing a course, right, we want to be able to select which course are we editing. So this can be simply done by adding a new edit button to each one of the courses, right, that that copies that specific course. Remember, we're iterating over this. This is a closure, so it remembers the course that was the value of the course when it was iterating, which course it was that was used to create this button. So it knows which course. So there'll be 20 courses. This will be for button 1, it will be course 1. For button 2, it'll be course 2, and so on. And so when we use set course, what's going to do is it's going to copy the value of the course, onto the input field. So if we click it on the rocket propulsion, it'll copy course right into these input fields in this text area. So it'll put the name of the rocket propulsion, right, and then the description for the rocket propulsion course. So that this only updates it and copies it into this input field, right? So that you can now edit the values. And then we'll add a new button, right? That if you click on the button, it's going to be able to save those changes and update the course. Now, to update the course, right, we're going to use the common or familiar strategy of, of flipping or replacing the old course, right, with a new course. Right? If you look at the current array of courses, it contains all the current courses, including the course that we're editing. But we do have the latest value for that course here in the state variable. So courses contains all the existing courses, including the one we're currently editing, of which we have selected one of them to be edited and have copied it into the state variable course. And then we do all the changes using our input field, our text area, date pickers, blah, blah, blah. So now course holds the latest version of the edited course. So what we're going to do is that we're going to compute a new array of courses that is going to copy over all the old courses, right, except the one that we are editing. Right, so here we're going to return either the old course, right, or the new course here that we are editing. And we're going to do that by comparing the IDs, right? If the ID is of the current course that we're iterating over, right? If it matches the course that we're editing, if it is, then we want the new instance, right? The new value. So we're returning, right? The new array contains all the instances of whoever is being returned here. It returns course, right? Which is the latest edited course. So it'll be the new name, the new description. Right now, if instead the IDs don't match, then I'm just going to keep the old course, right? It's not being edited. It's not the one that we're editing. So most of the courses that are being set here, most of the courses that are being computed are just basically the same courses that were there. Only one of them is being swapped out, okay? And finally, we'll need a button that saves the changes, right? That, as we're editing the course, we can change the update, and those changes are then saved, right? We run the update course, right, to recalculate the array, and then it's going to re-render the array of courses down below, and we'll see that the new title has changed. So if we say update, now it copies the new title right into the new one, right, and it re-renders, and you see the change take effect. Okay, we also need to prevent the default, right, because the edit button is still inside of the card, inside of the link, and just like the delete button, right, we don't want it to navigate right to the course. We want to stay in the same dashboard, right? We just want to select that particular course for editing. Okay. All right. So we took a look of how to implement this using useState. Okay. But now let's practice using a reducer. Right. Now, why? Why even bother? Well, one of the things that you'll notice that if you start playing around with our implementation is that even though we are able to change the title and the description, if you actually navigate to the course, if you navigate and click on it, you'll notice that in the in the courses, right, the name of the course will be the old. Right, we'll see that where we're displaying the course in the courses screen. the change actually will not have taken effect. And the reason is that the current implementation for the courses page and the layout where it grabs the course, it's actually using a copy of the courses in the database. That means that each page is maintaining their own copy of the courses array, right? And they both have copies of that in memory, and the dashboard is manipulating one copy, but the courses screen is using a different copy, right? That initially they are the same, so obviously they if you navigate from one to the other, the names are the same, right? But when you're editing one in the dashboard, obviously it's not the same copy that the courses is using, so we won't see those changes. Or if you say you create a new course and then you navigate, you'll notice that we won't be able to see any modules or even a name, because that new course in the dashboard doesn't trickle to the courses. So here's an example of why would you use solutions such as Redux or ZooStan or Context, right? We want to put the data right in a place that is going to be used by everybody, so that there will be a single source of truth, instead of several copies of the courses. So what we're going to do is that we're going to move our implementation that we just did in the dashboard. We're going to move it to a reducer. Okay, so here's an example of that, the beginnings of this reducer, right? We are going to load the same courses that we were loading for the dashboard screen, but this time around, we're going to store it in a state in a reducer, so that it's available right through several pages, right? In this case, at least between the dashboard page and the courses page, right? It needs to be consistent. They both need to pull from the same data source. Okay, so we already know how to create a reducer, right? We create a slice, we define an initial state, right? We give it a unique name, right? And then here are the same functions that we implemented in the dashboard page, but re-implemented here as reducer functions, right? We have the same name, right? Add new course, delete course, and so on, right? They're all implemented here. The logic, the algorithm is identical to what we did in the dashboard page, but obviously the syntax is slightly different. New course is exactly the same, right? We have course, we have the ID, and then to set the new courses array is slightly different. In the dashboard page, we were using the set courses mutator function. Here we don't have that. We have direct access to the array that we're maintaining in the state. Right here, this is the array courses. So we can access the current reference to the courses by doing state.courses, and we're setting it to a new array. Okay, this is identical to what we did in the dashboard page, right? We copy over the old courses and we append the new course at the end of the array. Delete course is the same implementation we did in the dashboard page, right? We were filtering over the existing courses. We're going to remove the one that matches the ID. And the way we pass the ID is to the payload. Right? Remember that this is data that is being sent over from the user interface, and whatever data we pass into the user interface, the dispatcher, right, when it calls this function from the dispatch, it packages it right into an action object, right? This is the action object, and the action object is a meta. It has some meta information in there, mostly that we ignore, we don't care about. The only thing that we care about in that action object is the payload. Payload is everything that we're going to send from the user interface. In this case, we are sending a course ID. So here, the payload is that string, that course ID, and so we're renaming it here. This colon here is not a data type. We're saying, I want to rename it locally so that it's called course ID. Same thing here, right? When we add a new course, we're going to send in a course object, right, from the user interface, right? And that includes the edited title, the edited description, and so on. And so locally, we're going to call it the payload. We're going to call it course, right? Just a more useful name, right? And we create the new course from that, and we append it at the end, right? And then finally the update course, right, is again same implementation. We're going to iterate over the old courses, and if it's not the ID, then we keep the old course. But if it's the new one, then we keep the new version of the course, right, that we've been editing, and here it is. Okay, we export all the functions, right, so that we can import them from the user interface, and then we can invoke them right through dispatch. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to create a store that is going to be used, specifically for the Kambaz application. If you remember, we had already created a store, but that was for the lab exercises, right? And so here it's a store that's going to be only for the Kambaz application, right? We're going to initialize it with a single reducer, right? From the reducer we just created. We're going to import that and add it here. Now we're going to have several other slices, right? They're going to declare, reducers for the users, for assignments, for the quizzes, for the modules, and each one is going to be added, right, to this global reducer, right, that we can then pull from the components. Right, so once we have the store, we can provide that store to the rest of the application. So we're going to import the provider from React Redux, the store that we just created, right, and then we're going to wrap the entire code of the Kambaz application, right, with the provider, so that all components under there should be able to access that store. Now that we declared the store, we provided it, we can go back to the dashboard and re-implement it so that it doesn't use the use state. Okay, so instead of declaring the courses using the use state, we're going to instead select the courses from the reducer that we just created, right? And we're going to copy it locally, right? And if we need to talk back to the reducer, we're going to need a dispatch, right? Here are all the functions that we are importing from the reducer. And so these are going to replace the event handlers that we had implemented in the prior set of examples, right? We had implemented all these guys, right? So all these are moved over to the reducer, right? And we are now importing them. We're going to use this instead. We just need to remember that whenever we were using these functions now, because we're invoking these in a reducer, we're going to have to wrap them inside a dispatch. The course object is still going to stay as a state variable, and this is an example of a collaboration between global state and local state, right? The course here makes sense to keep it here because we are editing this course in a local input field, right? The text in the text area, and as we are editing it, we're manipulating, we're typing, we're changing the local state, and not until we either click on add or we click on update, then will we pass this local instance so that we can enact changes in the global state. Okay, so this is a good example of using both local state and global state, right? And they're working together. So here's all those functions that we were calling, based on all these event handlers where we are deleting or updating or adding new courses, right? Because now they are implemented in a reducer, we do need to wrap them inside of a dispatch. And dispatch is the one who's going to be responsible for creating the action object that is going to reach the reducer function, right? And also the payload. And the payload is whatever we pass here, right? So the payload here is the course, right? Updating the course, right? Or a primary key or a string or number. So it could be as simple as a primary key, or it could be complex as an array or an object. So now that the courses is available in a single place, right? The reducer, Now it's available everywhere, right? Anywhere under the Kambaz directory, right? Or the Kambaz root component. And so now the courses layout, right, can retrieve the courses from the reducer, and then based on the course ID, right, when you navigate, as you navigate to that particular page, the ID is encoded in the URL. We can parse that out from using use params, and then given the array of the array of all the courses, we can look up that specific course, matching the ID. Once we find it, we have course, right? And then we can print out the name of the course. All right, so let's do something similar with modules. Again, we're going to first, right, implement all the CRUD operations using the useState, right? And we're going to deliberately create some complex behavior that is going to force us to pass around the state, across multiple components, right? And what I want you to see is how cumbersome it is to, for multiple components to, integrate them and have them talking to one another by, passing data, through their properties, and then also passing functions so that they are calling back. And so what I'm going to point out is that this sharing of the data across multiple components can get out of hand, right? And cause things such as what we refer to as property drilling, right? That you are passing all the state, from a parent component down to the leaves of a particular branch, a component branch, and even though in that chain you might have components that don't need those state variables or those functions, they still need to pass them around because the branches need them. And so this creates tight coupling between all the components in that chain, right? And that's a problem. Makes the code brittle, makes it easier to break, right? You start moving things around, and tight coupling in general is a bad practice. Another problem that we'll point out as we implement the stateful modules is that the modules page is going to become fairly complex. That it's going to be maintaining the state, it's going to be handling all the events, it's going to implement all the event handlers, plus it's going to be implementing all the rendering, right, of the modules. It's going to iterate over the modules, right, and whatnot. Now, this also is a bad practice, right, to have one component be responsible for so many things, right? So what Redux is going to allow us to do is going to allow us to separate the concerns of handling, of maintaining state. We're going to move all that into a reducer, right, which implements the best practice of separation of concern, right? We're going to keep the component, the page, having only the responsibility of rendering the content, but it's not going to have the responsibility of maintaining state, right, of handling events and whatnot, right? That responsibility is going to move over to the reducer, right? So each part, right, is going to be responsible for a small a portion of the task, right, where the reducers are going to maintain state, event handling, implementing all the CRUD logic, whereas the page is going to be responsible only for rendering the content, right? And this is a good practice, right, of separating the concerns. Okay, so let's start. The current implementation for the modules is very much like we did in the dashboard, right? It was using the modules in the database, right, to initialize a local constant called modules, and then we just iterated those modules, right? We did have some logic in there to filter out the modules so that depending on the course ID, we were only rendering the modules for that course. But that's something different. So because we want to be able to manipulate these modules, we're going to convert it into a state variable, right? And it's going to contain an array of modules. Once we have that, right, we we're going to create a couple of components that are going to be tasked with changing or adding or editing the names of the course, right? I mean, we could have followed the same strategy that we did for courses, right? We had an input field, a text area, but here we're going to do a little more interesting. We're going to create a dialog. So let's create a dialog that is going to allow us to edit the title of the module. The reason I'm creating a new component also is, again, I want to point out the complexity of the dependency of this component with other components, right? So this component, for instance, is necessarily going to be a child of the modules component. And because the modules are being kept, the state variables are being kept in the modules, right? Somehow that data needs to make its way to the dialog, right? In particular, the name of the module, also, as you're editing the module, right? The state variable of the input field that you're editing here, right? That's going to live here in the modules, okay? But I need to make it available here in this dialog, right? I need to pass it around, and so I mean, if it were just that, then maybe it's okay, right? But it's there's going to be several layers that we are passing this data around until it reaches this dialog, and that's what I'm trying to point out. The likely risk, right, of having property drilling, right, when all these properties are being passed around from parent to child to grandchild to great grandchild, all the way down to the particular dialog, right, that makes it hard to integrate these components. So here's module editor. Module editor implements this dialog using the modal component that is declared in Bootstrap, and it has a couple of attributes to control when the dialog pops up, and then what events is going to cause it to then dismiss. And to do that, right, to show and handle the close, right, we are passing functions here. Show is going to be a Boolean, right, whereas handle close is a function, right, that is going to be passed in, right, to this module editor. And now this is going to be triggered when we click on the module, the plus here, plus module in the module controls, right? In this module controls, we have these buttons, right? One of them is the module plus module. So when we click on that, we want to call or tell the dialog, hey, display yourself, right? And so notice that module controls is a component that is a direct child of the modules, right? If you remember, in modules, we had the the left side is the course navigation, and then you have the modules. In the modules, you have the list of modules down below, but then at the top, you have these buttons. You have these buttons here, right? And so this is the button that is going to cause the module editor to trigger, right, to display, right? So here in the module controller is where we're going to keep track of a toggle Boolean expression on whether the dialog should show or not show. And we're going to pass the handle close to the module editor so that the module editor, when we click on this X here, right, or we click on cancel, right, we can cause the dialog to disappear, right? So we're passing handle close as an argument, right, here, so that we can invoke it whenever either we press on the escape key, or we press on the X, or we press on cancel. We're going to call handle close so that it will close. It will close, right. It will set the show right to false, and then show, right, is going to cause the module editor to hide, right, because we use it here as a variable that controls whether the modal is displayed or not. Okay. So anyway, so what's in the modal here? In the modal, we also have an input field, right, where we can change the module name. right? And as we type, we're going to update the module name. So presumably this is being implemented as a state variable that we don't have control over, right? It's being the initial value is being passed to us here, the name of the module, this here, so we can type it. And as we're typing, we're calling this function that's being passed to us, right, to accumulate those changes, right? And it's the state is going to be implemented here in the modules page in a minute. Okay, so first we have the module editor, right, that we can edit the module with initial value. We can change the module as we type. Plus, if we click on the add module button here, we're going to call a callback function called add module, which we're gonna pass as argument the latest name of the module, right? And an add module will append the module to this state variable of modules. Okay, but then add module is going to be implemented up here in the modules page, right? Because the module page contains the state variable. Okay, so yeah, here is the intermediate modules control, right? That if we click on the plus module here, we're going to call handle show, which sets the state variable set show to true, which gets passed down to the module editor, and we know what the module editor does with that, right? That causes the modal to display. Okay. We also pass to the module editor, right? The module name, the set module, and the add module that actually gets passed down to us, right? So this here, right? The control, right? The module control actually is not maintaining the state for the module name, right? Instead, it's being passed to it from the page, the modules page. So the modules page is the one who's going to be maintaining the state of the name of the module, right? And also we're going to have an add module that appends a new module to the array of modules, right? But then they get passed to the module control, and the module controls passes it down to the module editor. And it's actually the module editor who actually needs these functions. And this is exactly an example of property drilling, right? It starts off with the parent here maintaining the state, the modules, declaring all the logic, the event handlers, passing it to module controls only because module controls needs to pass it down to module editor. It is module editor who actually needs these functions, right? And so it's unfortunate that that we have to even pass through module controls, right? Because module control doesn't really do anything with module name, set module, add module. It's only through here because we're passing it down to on its way to the actual component that needs these values, right? And this is a very, very common issue, right? That we're passing data across multiple components, which it's exacerbated if these trees hierarchies are very long. If you have these branches of a parent component like modules, passing it down to a child, and that child to a grandchild, and then that grandchild to a great grandchild, and so on, right? And then having to call back, right? So that's an issue that we need to tackle. All right. So what about deleting editing modules? So what we're going to do to implement editing, right? We had implemented a modules control buttons, right? That these implemented the buttons for each one of the items, right? As we're iterating, that had the check mark and a plus and so on. So we're going to add a trash can here, right? And that trash can is, if you click on it, is going to call on the delete module function that is passed as an argument here, right? See that? And it's going to call back with the ID that we too are going to pass it down. We're going to pass it the ID of the module and also the delete module, so that when we click on this, it's going to call us back saying, hey, remove this particular module. And we're going to implement it, just like we implement all our deletes, right? It's going to take as argument the ID, and we're going to filter out from the modules that particular module that matches that ID. So with the new array, right, we set up the new modules, okay? And we have to make sure to pass along the dependencies, right, of the module ID and delete module, which is expecting right here. Okay. So yeah, so that deletes the item. Now let's do something a little more interesting. Let's add the capability of being able to edit a particular module name, right? Again, we could have used the dialog that we already have. Right? That certainly could be the case. But here we're going to do something a little more interesting. We're going to try to edit it in place, right? So that instead of popping up a dialog, we're going to swap the text, right, of the name of the module. We're going to swap it with an input field, right? So when we click on the button, we're going to turn on a flag saying, hey, we're editing this particular module, and it's going to replace this with an input field, right, that allows us to edit it. And then when we press enter, right, it's going to cause to take the new value, set it, and then re-render, and then remove the input field. So first, let's start off with a pencil icon from React Icons. And when we click it, we're going to call edit module with the module ID, right, that we're going to be passing to the module controls buttons, right? We already passing module ID, right, because we were using it for the delete module. So we can also use it for the edit module, right? And we are calling it back with that module ID. Back in the module screen, we're going to keep track of the modules, whether they're being edited or not, right? And the way we're going to do that is we are going to add a new flag to each one of the objects, right? So that we know that we are editing that specific module, right? So for instance, we're going to iterate over all the modules, looking for the modules that we're editing, right? We're passing the ID, okay? And if it is that module, then we return the module plus a new field called editing, right, whose value is true. Otherwise, we just keep the old module with no editing fields true, right? And we're going to use this to drive the logic in the item, right? So that if this flag is true for that specific module, we're going to display an input field so that you can edit it. If there is no editing field or property, then we're not gonna bother showing the input field. And then we're gonna have update, right? When we save or click OK and we're done, right, we're gonna pass in the latest version of the module, and we're going to replace it, right, based on the ID of the module. Now, back in the input field, right, where we are displaying the module as we're iterating over the module, right, we're going to use the new field editing, right, to drive the fact that we are either going to display the name of the module or we're going to display an input field. So if the editing module is true, then we're going to display this input field. But if it's not true or even non-existent, right, then we're just going to display the name of the module. So either one or the other, right? So when we're editing, we are going to display the input field, initialize the value to be the name of the module, right? And then as we are editing, as we're typing away, right, we are going to accumulate, right, the characters into the module name, right? But if you press enter, right, if it's a keyboard stroke, right, they're all going through here. Now, going through here, right? But if it is enter, right, then we call the update one last time. We keep the latest values of modules, but we're going to override editing to be false, right? So we stop the editing, this becomes false, and we just show the name of the module, right? And the input field is hidden. Okay, so we saw how to implement CRUD operations right within the modules page using local state, right? And now we can add modules, remove modules, update modules, and so on. Okay. But we saw that, right, because we had to share the state with other components. Right? So for instance, we saw that in the modules page, we declared some state variables, right, and all the CRUD operations, right, the add, the delete, the update. Well, we had to share them with other components, right? For instance, with the modules control that implemented the button, right? And then the button had to share those variables with the dialog, right? That implemented the editing of the actual name of the module. So notice that the state variable is being declared here in the modules page, but it's actually needed here in the dialog, right? And the only way to communicate between the module page and the dialog is to pass through this button, right? The control that pops up dialogues for for editing modules or whatnot. Okay, and so notice that even these properties, these parameters that are being passed to the module controls, it doesn't even need them, right? The component doesn't really need them. The only reason they're even here is because they are on their way, right, to be sent over to the dialog, right? So it's unfortunate that we even have to declare them here, right, in the argument list. But nevertheless, we still have to maintain the dependencies, right, of parent to child to grandchild. Okay, and so this is what we refer to as property drilling, right? That because we have to maintain these dependencies, right, and they have to be passed down, perhaps, from parent down to child to grandchild, and then the also we need to pass down, setters, right, set functions that update the state, down to the children because the child needs to be able to talk back to the parent, right? So to update the state, so we have to pass down data that needs to be rendered, and then functions we need to call, right, to update the state. And so this makes it very hard to modify the application in the future, right? Because you have all these dependency chains. So imagine this is only three components, but it could easily in a very complex application, this could be five levels, six levels down, and with all these functions and properties flowing around. And so if and just to maintain the dependencies between all these components, and if you try to move any of these elements outside of this particular folder, right, or you want to reuse it somewhere else, then you would need to recreate the same dependency, right? So it makes it very hard for you to modify the code. It's very stiff, and it doesn't allow you to do modifications very well. So in that case, we want to to avoid creating these very tight couplings between components. And another concern is that the module page is going to end up with all these functions, right? The add module, the update module, delete module, blah, blah, blah. All the CRUD operations live here in the page, right? And all the state lives here, all the event handlers live here, plus it's rendering. So there's actually way too many things that the page is doing. So not only are we creating tight coupling, which is bad, right? So it's a bad engineering choice, right? But also the page has way too many concerns, right? It's concerned on how to maintain the state, how to handle the events, and how to render that, right? So we want to be able to deal with this issue as well. We want to separate those concerns, right? And we want to minimize the dependency, okay? And for that, we're going to use Redux, right? We're going to move all the CRUD operations, so all these functions, add modules, delete modules, update modules, and also the state handling, all that is going to go away. None of this is going to live here, right? And the only thing that we're going to leave here is the rendering, right? And that's going to fix the issue of separation of concern, right? This no longer is going to live here. It's going to be elsewhere, and so that the page can focus on doing its best at just rendering the data, rendering the content. I mean, obviously here we're still going to have code that can pull the data, right, so that I can render it. but it's not going to be responsible for maintaining that state, right? Or doing the manipulation of the data, right? So it's only going to be responsibility is how to render that content. Whereas the reducer is going to be responsible for maintaining the data, right? Manipulating the data, right? Going to be like the model, right? In a model view controller, if you remember, one of the design choices there is that the view, right? Our user interface components only does rendering, right? It only interacts with the user. It's not concerned how the data is maintained, how it's manipulated. And so here our page is playing the role of the view. And the reducer, right, is only responsibility and focus is to maintain the data, implement all the data manipulation, very much like the model, right, in a model view controller design pattern, right? So the reducer in this case, notice that it's going to only maintain data. In this case, it's an array of modules, right? And it's going to implement all the CRUD operations, right? That create, read, update, delete modules. Notice that in here there is no code that has anything to do with the rendering. Notice that the file type is TS, right? It's not even TSX, right? So there's no HTML whatsoever here. So again, focusing on separation of concern, right? It only deals with data manipulation, no user interface code whatsoever. Okay. So these functions, the add module, right? We have delete module, update module. These are exactly the same. Well, not exactly. It's the same logic implementation that we already had implemented in the modules page, but obviously the syntax is slightly different, right? Instead of doing pushing or appending an array and whatnot, it's slightly different. We don't have setter functions. Instead, we update the local data structure, right? In this case, is this modules property that contains the array modules, right? We can update it, right, by setting it, assigning to the state.module. So state is this object, right, that contains the modules, and here we are updating it, right, to say, state.modules, and then the appending of the modules, new module to the end, right, of the array of modules, right? So these are the same functions, but implemented using the Redux API or Redux syntax. Okay, same thing with edit module that initializes the editing to be true. We then export all these functions so that we can import them from the user interface. Now we're going to add these new reducer to the store, right? Already we have the courses reducer in there, right? We're going to append here the modules reducer, so it's going to be accessible from our selector, right? We're going to be able to select the modules from this reducer. And here you would put all the other reducers for all the other slices of the data for different parts of the Kambaz application. So in here, you would also put the assignments reducer, right? If you're doing the quizzes, for the project, the quizzes reducer would go here. Also for working with users, logging in and maintaining, who the currently logged in user. Later on, we'll implement here an accounts reducer, right, to keep track of the currently logged in user. Okay. Once we have that reducer, we can re-implement the modules page so that it no longer declares modules as a local state variable. Instead, it's going to pull the modules from the store, right? So no longer this modules is a state variable. Instead, is in the modules reducer, which we're going to select, into our modules page, right, using the use selector. And once we have a copy of that, right, we can then iterate over it and display like we would normally. Okay. Also we are going to remove all the functions that were here, all the add module, update module, delete module, right, edit module. All those functions are no longer here, right? We're going to remove them all. Instead, we're going to use the reducer functions that are implemented in the reducer. And the syntax of calling these functions is almost identical as was before. The only difference is that we're going to need a dispatch, right? We're going to have to wrap those function calls with the dispatch. And so here it is, right? All these functions that were there already for adding a module and so on, right? We're just wrapping it with dispatch, right? So that we can send the new module, right? We can send it over to the reducer by calling the add module function in the modules reducer, right? Locally, we are going to clear out the module name that we are editing. Remember, this is also an example of collaboration between global state and local state. In our local state, we are with the editing of the module name in a local state variable. So that stays, right? So there it is. So that the module name is being maintained here in a local state, okay? And that's very common. It's a great choice, right? That we are editing of the form here in the local state, but then to make it available across the entire application, when we save, we are, when we add the module or edit or delete the module, we are updating the global state so that's globally available. So here's the other additional functions that we were calling to update the module and to edit the module and whatnot, right? We just have to remember to wrap them inside our dispatch. And finally, we have the delete as well, right? We wrap that up, right? As well as the edit module, which sets the edit flag to true. Okay, so we looked at implementing the courses and modules. First, we showed you how to do it using useState and then using Redux. Okay, so now let's look at implementing user management, right? In particular, we want to be able to log in, right? When we go out to the sign in screen, we want to be able to identify ourselves, right? And once the application knows who we are, we want to make sure that that information of the currently logged in user is available throughout the application. Certainly in the account screen, such as the sign in screen and the profile screen, certainly I want to be able to identify who I am so I can navigate to my profile, edit my information. But then I also want that information to be available elsewhere. For instance, I want to, when I get to the dashboard screen, I definitely want to know who we are, because we're enrolled in certain courses, right? So I might be enrolled in some courses, and you might be enrolled in a different set of courses. So not all the courses are viewable by everybody, right? So we want to be able to filter those courses per user. And as I navigate, throughout my application, it's good to know who it is that is logged in, right? So that one of the things that might be in the user profile is the role of the user, right? If they're system administrator, of their student, their faculty, their TA, and so that as we visit different screens, we might display different versions of those screens depending on who we are, right? So that if you are a faculty, then you do have access to being able to create new modules, delete a module, edit a module. But if you're a student, then you would not be able to do that, right? We wouldn't give you those buttons to create or edit or delete and whatnot. Okay, so knowing who the current user is, their role, right, is something that is certainly useful to know throughout the entire application. So we're going to implement the current user in a reducer. We're not going to show you first how to do it using state variables. There's no point. We already have determined that it's better to use a global state as opposed to a local state. So we're not even going to bother doing a local state. There's no point. But we are going to show that, again, there is an opportunity for both global state and local state to work together, especially for manipulating the form, editing the form, right, filling out the form, validations, and so on. That is best achieved in the local state, but finally that result of editing and updating and whatnot, right? The end result is to update the data in a global state. Okay. All right. So here we have a current user. That's the only thing that we're going to keep track here. I mean, there could be several other things, maybe like preferences and so on. And we're going to have a reducer that's going to allow us to set the current user, right? And for instance, when we log in, right, we'll be able to, once we identify the person from the database, right, we're going to be able to, update who the current user is, right? So this is a brand new reducer, and we're going to add it to the store, right? And again, all our reducers are going to be in this same store, which is the Kambaz store. Okay. All right, now that we have the reducer set up, we can now use it and to refactor our sign-in screen, right? So in our sign-in screen, and we want to be able to, from the database, check out to see who the current logged in user is, right? We want to, determine, right, whether a user is someone who we know, right, that has a particular role, right? And then if they do exist, we're going to use the set current user, right, in the reducer, right, to store that this is the current user. So we're going to have locally a set of fields that we're going to call the credentials, right? Which are going to be the username and password are going to be stored in our credentials. And these are going to be the two fields that we're going to be updating for, filling out for to identify ourselves, right? We're going to, type in our username, our password, and when we click on the sign in button, we're going to look up if we iterate over the database of users to see if we can find any user whose username and password match the fields, username and password fields that we are updating. If so, right, if user does not exist, we just return, we don't do anything. But if the user does exist, then we're going to store it in the reducer, right, in the global state. It says, hey, I did find a user, they are in the database, right? Let's store it in the reducer in the store, right? So that globally, all the other pages are going to be able to pull down who the current user is, right? And write logic based on whether somebody's logged in or not, and what is their role, right? Now, if I successfully logged in, right, we're going to redirect you and take you to the dashboard if this was successful. Otherwise, we're just going to return, we're going to stay in the sign-in screen. Now, we might be a little bit more helpful, maybe display an alert button and, dialogue and say, sorry, try again, right? That username and password we couldn't find, blah, blah, blah. Please try again, right? But here we're not doing that. Okay, so here's the input fields, right, for editing the username and password. This is, something that we've done before, so that's nothing new here, right? And the button that when we click is going to run the sign in function here and either log us in or not. Okay. Okay, so now that we have the sign in done, right, and we have determined that the user is logged in and we've stored it in the current user, now from all the other screens, right, including the dashboard, the modules, the courses, anywhere, right, we can pull down from the reducer, from the store, we can pull down the current user by selecting from the account reducer, right? We can pull down the current user. And now, if we have enrollments, right, in the database, we could filter out, right, instead of displaying all the courses, we can filter out the courses so that we only show the courses where the current user, right, appears as the user in the enrollments, right, and the course is equal to the ID of the course. So this filters out so that, if once we know the current user's ID, right, we can pattern match it with the enrollments so that we filter out. So you don't see all 20 courses. You only see 3 or 4 courses that you are enrolled in. Okay. All right. So now that we have the current logged in user, the current user, we can use it to drive other inputs, right? Or other navigation things or logic, right? Based on whether you logged in or not, right? That we would show certain hyperlinks or not show them depending maybe on your role. And so for instance, if the current implementation for the navigation, the account navigation is that we would always show the three links, right? Profile, sign in, and sign up. All three are displayed, which makes no sense, right? Because if you are logged in, then why would we show you the sign in and sign up links? And vice versa. If you're not logged in, why would we show you the profile screen link? Right? You're not logged in. You should not be able to navigate to the profile screen, right? So we could determine, right, depending on whether you're logged in or not, right, whether to display one set of links or another set of links, right? So we could say, we can pull the current user, right, and if you are logged in, then we would show you only the profile link. But if you're not logged in, so if current user is null or undefined, then the links should only be sign in and sign up. There shouldn't be a profile link, right? And then we can iterate, right? We can iterate over those links, right, and display them. And same thing in the account page, right? The account page right now was blindly, first thing that you would see is the sign-in screen, right? When you come to the Kambaz application. So it was automatically just redirecting you to the sign-in page, right? But what about if you are already logged in? If you're already logged in, it makes no sense to take you to the sign-in screen, right? So what we could do is have a logic of checking to see if somebody's logged in. Here's the current user. If there is no current user, then yes, send them to the sign-in screen. I don't know who you are, go to the sign-in screen. But if I do know who you are and current user is not undefined, right, then I will navigate you directly to the profile screen, right? So again, we can be smart here, right, and navigate to different parts and hide and show different behaviors, different uh, different links, different buttons, right, depending who you are. Or you could be even more nuanced, right, depending not only whether the user exists or not, but maybe based on their role, right? So that if this could become even more powerful, so that if not only if there's a user, but if the user role is admin, maybe we show them an admin link, right, that would allow them to go into an admin page where they can do all sorts of things, right, based on their role. So not only are you logged in, but based on your role, you can do all these other things. Okay. All right, so we built the link that navigates us to either the profile or the sign-in screen. Let's look at the profile screen right now. We do have it a little bit neglected. Okay, so now that there is a current user, we've logged in, we have identified them from the database, and we have populated that user in the current user. Well, now that we navigate to the profile screen, we can pull down that user, right, from the reducer, okay, and copy it into a local variable, right? So here's a nice little set here, right, that it integrates both global state and local state, right? For local state, we're going to have a local profile state variable, right, that we want to be able to edit, right? We want to edit our first name, last name, email, phone, address, things like that, our profile information, okay? And what we're going to do is that we're going to initialize it, see? We're initializing it with the current user that we are pulling from our state variable, from our global state variable, okay? We copy our current user as the initial value of the profile so we can edit it, right? And then when we edit it, we can save it, right? We can save updating the current user, right, using a dispatch and sending the profile to update the current state, the current user globally, okay? For sign out, right? Sign out would mean that I'm in the profile screen. There's a sign out button, and if I click on the sign out button, presumably no one is logged in anymore, right? I'm not logged in anymore. So what we can do is we can dispatch saying that the current user is null, right? So nobody's logged in now, right? And then redirecting to the sign-in screen, right? So now this would allow me to sign in as someone else. Okay. For the um, for the initialization of this screen, I'm introducing here a hook called use effect. So use effect, right, works in tandem with use state. Okay, it allows you to initialize the state of the application when the component or page first load, right? In this particular case, we don't really need it because we have already initialized the state, right? We have initialized it with a global state. But in an upcoming lecture, the all this information about the profile, who is currently logged in and whatnot, all that is going to be pulled from the server. It is the server who is going to be responsible for grabbing and finding out who is currently logged in, okay, and maintaining that application state, okay. So in that sense, the use effect will be required. Use effect is going to allow us to make, for instance, queries out to the server, right? Fetch information from the server, who is currently logged in, and then we would be able to, get that information, which we don't have here, and then update and initialize our component, right, with that data from the server. Here we don't need that, but it's a sneak peek where we're going next week, next lecture. But a simple example of that is, unload. If we didn't have that, if we didn't have this line here of initializing the current state, maybe we would set it to null or something. And this is the alternative. Here, unload is calling a function that has current user. Current user has already been, retrieved, right? We already have a local copy from the reducer, right? And this is just checking to see, well, if current user doesn't exist, I'm going to send you to sign in if nobody's logged in. Otherwise, if someone is logged in, I'm going to set the current profile right to the current user. So basically, this line of set profile is basically doing this, right? Initializing the profile to the current user, right? If there's somebody logged in. This will be much useful in what we're going to be doing, working on next lecture. So now that the profile has been initialized with the current user that's logged in, right, we can populate the fields that will allow us to manipulate the profile, right? We can manipulate the username, the password, right, with just regular input fields and the on change, first name, last name, date of birth, and whatnot. Okay. And finally, one thing that we're allowing folks to do is to choose their own role. So if I was a student, I can change my role to be admin or faculty. That's pretty cool, which is fine. Which is fine as for our purposes, because right, we want to, obviously this is not a real application. It makes it easier for TAs to be able to grade your assignments. That one person can become a different role, right, and change from faculty to student and whatnot, and make sure that your user interfaces are correctly displaying the correct things, the correct pages, the correct buttons, right, and protecting certain areas of the application correctly based on the role. So this is actually very useful for the grading by TAs. And finally, the last uh, implementation in the profile is that it can either sign out and call sign out, right? The function which we saw earlier basically sets the current user to null, so there's no one logged in, right? And then it navigates you out to the sign-in screen, or you can click on a save button, and which calls the set current user with profile, right? And it saves the changes, maybe a new email, a new address, right? And all that information would be available, in the global scope. Okay, the assignment screen, you're going to be working that on your own, right? You're going to, create a reducer, an assignment reducer, right? Very much following the examples what we've seen so far, right? You've seen already quite a few. We've seen the courses reducer, right? The modules reducer, the users, the accounts reducer, and all the examples that we saw in the labs, right? You're going to create a page, right? That you already have from the prior assignment that is going to allow you to edit the assignments, right? Right now, your assignments are not editable, right? It only displays the assignments in the quote unquote database, but you can't change them. You can't create new assignments. You can't delete assignments, right? So you're going to create all the CRUD operations, be able to create, update, delete assignments, right, as described in the book, right? And you're going to create the an assignments JSON file. You're going to download. I think I provided a link for that, and you're going to add it to the quote unquote database, and you're going to create a reducer that implements all the CRUD operations of being able to create new assignments, delete an assignment, update an assignment, right? And these you're going to have to tie it to the screens that allow you to create new assignments, right? Plus, going to do the same thing as modules, right? Of adding a new assignment, right? And then allows you to edit that assignment. So yeah, take a look at the description that we have in the book, right? And you follow the instructions. Take a look at the requirements described there. Okay. Now, if you see that the JSON file is missing some fields, maybe the JSON file doesn't have these fields like due date or available from or until or points. Just add some values in there, make them up. That's fine, and so that you have something to work with when you render those screens. Okay. Also, in this assignment, you're going to be working on the enrollment screen. So this is going to be an enhancement on the dashboard. So right now, the dashboard, right, is going to display the courses for which you are enrolled. Right, we saw an example of that, how to implement that. Right, I am providing to you an enrollments JSON file, right, that maps users to courses and which users are enrolled in which courses. And right now that's static, right? So if I log in as user one, I see a set of courses. If I enroll as user two, I see a different set of courses. Well, in this implementation, you're going to add an enrollments button, right? That by default, it displays only the courses to which you are enrolled, right? So it shows you only have these 4 courses that you're enrolled. But if you click on this button, enrollment, right, and then the dashboard changes differently. It shows more courses, right? It shows certainly the courses that you are enrolled in, right? But then it also shows the courses that you're not enrolled in. Okay, and so now it gives you buttons to change that state, right? If you are not enrolled in a course, it's going to display an enroll button, right, in green that is going to allow you to enroll in that course. So basically, you're gonna have to implement a reducer that manipulates the enrollments, right, so that you can enroll into a course or unenroll from a course, right? So the enrollments is not going to be now a hard-coded enrollments array, right? It's an array that changes over time as you enroll and unenroll. Right? Same thing, right? If you are enrolled in a course, you'll get an unenroll button, and if you are not enrolled, you'll get an enroll green button. Okay, in the enrollment here toggles this, right? So either if you click it again, it displays only the ones that you are enrolled. If you click it another time, it shows the buttons the to enroll and unenroll. Now you can change how this button looks and how it behaves. Maybe you want 2 buttons, that's fine. Maybe you want like tabs that shows maybe your courses and all courses. You're free to re-implement it any which way you want, right? But you do need to be able to manipulate or see only the courses that you are enrolled in, and another screen or another version that allows you to manipulate that relationships on whether you're enrolled or not in a course, right? So yeah, you're kind of free to modify how you navigate between enrollments or not. Okay. So here's just an idea of more explanations on what happens when you click on enroll or enrollments.